Dear Cherlyn, I arrived at the Weld County Jail the night of August 15th.
Chris Watts, his letters from jail, and an Oz exclusive.
Is he admitted that he actually killed his daughters not once, but twice?
His words, his details, his confession.
When he put his hands on her neck, he couldn't let go.
Coming up next.
There is a moment after every major crime when the world goes quiet. The headlines fade, the debates slow down, and the story, at least publicly, feels finished. For most people, the Chris Watts case ended the day he was sentenced. A courtroom, multiple life sentences, a confession that closed the legal chapter of one of the most disturbing family annihilation cases in modern history. Justice on paper had been served. But prison does something to stories. It doesn't end them. It changes how they're told. Because when the cameras disappear and the public moves on, something else begins. Silence. And inside that silence, there is time. Time to think, time to remember, time to reinterpret, time to rewrite. And sometimes, time to write letters. Years after the murders of Cherlyn Watts and her daughters Bella and Celeste, communication began quietly. Not through official statements, but through personal correspondence. Letters written from a prison cell by a man whose story the world believed it already understood. These letters did not arrive all at once. They surfaced slowly, piece by piece. Conversations that were never meant for a courtroom began entering public discussion, and with them came something unsettling. New details, shifts in tone, and questions about whether the story had truly been finished or simply paused. Because when someone begins telling their story again after conviction, the question is no longer just what happened. The question becomes why they are speaking now. Chris Watts had already confessed. He had already been sentenced. There was nothing left to gain legally. No jury to persuade. So why write? Why reach out to someone on the outside? Why invite conversation about a crime that had already defined him forever? Some offenders disappear into silence. Others search for something else: understanding, relevance, forgiveness, control. Letters can become a way to shape memory, a way to soften responsibility, a way to explain the unexplainable, or sometimes a way to rewrite the narrative. And that possibility is what makes these letters unsettling. Because they do not exist in the chaos of an investigation. They exist after evidence, after confession, after sentencing, when every word is no longer pressure, but choice. Choice matters. What someone chooses to say when they no longer have to can reveal more than what they said when everything was at stake. In this episode of Sinister Tales, we are not revisiting the crime itself for shock. We are examining what happened after the world stopped watching. The correspondence, the narrative shifts, the psychological patterns that emerge when an offender begins telling their story again, from behind prison walls. Because sometimes the most disturbing part of a case isn't the crime. It's what comes next. And it began with a letter. Before we go deeper, tell me where you're watching from. I always find it fascinating how stories like this travel across the world. And if you value fact-focused true crime that explores behavior, psychology, and the details that don't always make headlines, consider subscribing to Sinister Tales. Because this story didn't end in the courtroom. In many ways, that was just the beginning.
On today's True Crime, Colorado dad Chris Watts horrified the country when he confessed to brutally murdering his wife, Cherlyn, their unborn son, and their daughters, Bella and Celeste. Now, in his series of prison letters, he's revealing shocking new details about his crimes for the first time. Today, I'm sitting down exclusively with the woman who received these letters from Watts, so we can understand why would a father do this. But first, take a look at the monstrous acts Chris Watts committed that landed him in prison for the rest of his life. The story shocked the world. A devastated father pleading for the return of his pregnant wife and their two small daughters, who'd vanished after his wife returned from a weekend business trip. If you're out there, just come back. If somebody has her, just please bring her back. I need to see everybody. I need to see everybody again. To the outside world and on social media, Chris and Shanann Watts appeared a picture-perfect couple, shown smiling together with their two young girls and happily anticipating the birth of their third. But just hours after his impassioned plea for their return, Chris Watts would confess to his father that he'd killed his pregnant wife after accusing her of strangling their two young daughters.
I freaked out. No, just rage.
But ultimately, Watts would be arrested and charged with killing 34-year-old Shanann, 4-year-old Bella, 3-year-old Cece, and his unborn child. Their bodies were found on the grounds of the petroleum plant where Watts worked. Shanann in a shallow grave, and the little girls placed inside oil and gas tanks. Chris Watts ultimately pleaded guilty to murdering his entire family.
The most inhumane and vicious crime that I have handled out of the thousands of cases that I have seen.
Watts was sentenced to life in prison, leaving Shanann's devastated family and friends with so many questions.
Before the letters, before the analysis, before the conversations that would resurface years later, there was the image. Chris Watts did not look like the man people expected. That detail matters, because some cases shock the world for what happened. Others shock the world because of who appeared to be involved. And in August 2018, the Watts family looked ordinary. Photographs showed smiles. Videos showed routine: a husband, a pregnant wife, 2 young daughters. Suburban normalcy, the kind people recognize instantly. There were no public warning signs that matched what was about to happen. On the morning Shanann Watts and her daughters Bella and Celeste were reported missing, the story began the way many missing person cases do: concern, confusion, urgency. A friend noticing something wasn't right, phone calls unanswered, a house that felt quiet in the wrong way. Chris Watts appeared on camera as a worried husband. He spoke softly, calmly. He asked for his family to come home. And for a brief moment, the world watched a man who looked like he was waiting, not a man who already knew. That contrast would later become one of the most disturbing elements of the case. Because investigations move differently than public perception. What feels like uncertainty on the outside can look very different once evidence begins to surface. And in the days that followed, the narrative began to shift. Timeline inconsistencies, behavioral observations, digital evidence. The image started to crack. As investigators worked through the timeline, another layer emerged. A hidden relationship. An affair that introduced motive, secrecy, and a second life running parallel to the one the public saw. That discovery reframed everything. Routine behavior became suspicious in hindsight. Small details carried more weight. And the calm demeanor that initially read as composure began to feel different. More controlled, more distant, more deliberate. Eventually, the story moved from missing persons investigation to homicide case. Confession followed, then sentencing. Multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. Legally, the case reached its endpoint quickly, compared to the scale of public attention surrounding it. There was no prolonged trial, no years of courtroom testimony. The legal chapter closed with unusual speed, leaving many people with the sense that the full story had been compressed into a conclusion, rather than explored through a long public process. And that matters. Because when a case ends quickly in court, curiosity doesn't disappear. Questions don't disappear. They settle into the background. Psychological questions, behavioral questions, Questions about motive that legal outcomes don't always answer. Why did this happen? When did the shift begin? Was the person the world saw ever real, or was it a role? These are the kinds of questions that keep cases alive long after sentencing. But for a while, the story did grow quiet. Media coverage slowed. Public attention moved on. The image of Chris Watts became fixed in a single frame. The father who committed an unimaginable crime and accepted a plea deal that closed the legal narrative faster than many expected. Closure legally. Silence publicly. And silence creates space. Space for reflection. Space for reinterpretation. Space for a new version of the story to emerge. Not from investigators, but from the person at the center of it. Because prison changes the environment of storytelling. There is no immediate pressure, no interrogation room, no courtroom strategy, only time, memory, and the desire for some offenders to be understood, explained, or heard again. That is the space where this next chapter begins. Not with evidence, with correspondence. Because sometime after the sentencing, Chris Watts started writing, and someone on the outside started listening. If you're still here, you already understand this case is about more than headlines. It's about behavior, before, during, and after the crime. Subscribe to Sinister Tales if you want deep dives into the psychological side of real cases. And tell me in the comments, do you think a confession ends a story, or does it sometimes start a new one? Because in this case, the next part didn't begin with an investigation. It began with a connection.
In search of answers, recently retired grandmother Cherlyn Cadle approached Watts to take part in a book she was writing about the case. Surprisingly, he agreed. The result? Startling new first-hand confessions Watts made to Cadle in letters and during visits she made to him in prison. Today, Cherlyn Cadle shares insights into what really turned Chris Watts from a seemingly devoted husband and father into a cruel, cold-blooded killer. Cherlyn Cadle joins us now. She's the author of the new book, Letters from Christopher, The Tragic Confessions of the Watts Family Murders. Cherlyn, you've never written a book before. You've never even reached out to a prisoner. No. Why Chris Watts?
I don't know, just seeing him the morning of, on the front porch when he was looking for his family and telling the TV cameras that they just vanished. I knew by watching him he was guilty. It was easy to see that he was. And I felt something. I felt called to write this story to help get in his mind enough to see why he would do something like that to his family.
In order to write the story, you had to get in touch with him. You had to gain his confidence. We're going to talk about a lot of these letters in a second, and I've read through them, and there are specific questions I have, but there are some horrific things that he admitted to you in conversations and in the letters. One of the things that struck me powerfully, as a father and his grandfather, is he admitted that he actually killed his daughters not once, but twice. Yes. What did he mean by that?
Well, the morning of, he went into his baby girls' rooms and took a pillow from their bed and smothered them. And then he went into his room with Shanann and lay down next to her. They argued a little, and he murdered her. So then he was wrapping her in the sheets, and both girls got up and saw him and started questioning what's wrong with Mommy, what happened to Mommy. Bella, the oldest one, was crying. She had obviously been traumatized. She had bruises above her eyes, and you could tell she'd been traumatized. And also, Cece was more kind of confused, but she was awake, the younger one. So they ran around the house, literally, and cried and was watching what was going on as he drugged Shanann down the stairs. He couldn't pick her up, or he tried to pick her up, but she was too heavy for him. They were in a two-story home, so he drug her down the stairs.
Oh my goodness.
put her in the back of his pickup truck, and then proceeded to put each of the girls in the back seat with their little feet dangling over the seat on top of their mommy. And they rode an hour like that to the oil fields.
He drove them to their burial ground.
Yes. So
They trusted their father.
oh, of course they did. You know, they loved him. You know, Bella's seen on cameras singing the song, "Daddy, You're My Hero." He was the one that was entrusted to take care of them. So
Chris told Cherlyn that his daughter Bella was the only one who put up a fight, saying, I'm quoting this, "I will hear her soft little voice for the rest of my life." And she was saying, "Daddy, no. Daddy, no." I mean, you're a mom, a grandma. How hard is it to hear that even now?
it's very hard. I have a 3-year-old granddaughter myself, and I can't even imagine her skinning her knee. It hurts me. It's been difficult, at best. It's been very difficult.
He said lots of things to you, and I want to get into his mind, which is why I wanted to have you on.
Yes.
One issue is, how aware is he of what he did and currently doing? He apparently made overtures to his ability to take care, for example, of that 3-year-old granddaughter. Is that true?
Yes, he asked me if I was out of prison now, would you allow me to watch your grandchild? And he, by saying that, was trying to say he, you know, has remorse enough that he would never hurt anyone again. So, and it's easy for me to say, absolutely not. I would never leave my grandchild. And Christopher, what are you thinking by asking that question?
What does it say about him that he even asked the question? Does he think he's trustworthy?
I think he does. He's narcissistic. Very much everything is about him. Through a lot of the confessions that he made to me, a lot of it has been about how badly he hurts and how badly it is for him, which seems very narcissistic to me.
Why does he say he did it? This is a man, I've been searching for clues that he could have even done this. I can't find any reason why any of us sitting here right now would have suspected he could possibly even do it.
Right. He was very much a seemingly family man, good dad. Spent a lot of time with the girls, helped his wife around the house, helped her while she did her sales and that type of thing. So, you know, asking him, why wouldn't you just get a divorce? Because millions of people get divorces, so why wouldn't you just walk away if you had to be away from Shanann? Because he says the reason is, well, he'll go back and forth with blaming different things. You know, the mistress, the fact that he didn't pray for 3 months before this happened, that there's a darkness that was over him. He's even went as far as saying a demon was in him, which maybe that's true. If you can do something like that, it does seem a little evil, very evil, actually.
Yeah. Although evil is clearly, this is a definition of it, but I'm curious, I mean, does he blame his mistress, for example? Does he say it was her? If it wasn't for her, I wouldn't have murdered my wife, unborn child, 2 beautiful daughters. Right. How does he excuse this in his mind?
I don't know, because that is exactly what he has said. If I had never met Nikki, I would, this would never have happened, he says, which makes absolutely no sense to anyone at all. But he's very, you know, Christopher has, he's not outgoing at all. He's very closed off. I never saw emotions from him. I didn't see him laugh. I didn't see him cry. I didn't see him excited. He's very quiet. So, you know, he's been harder to read than some people because you get nothing. It's just like a blank.
Well, as I go through these letters, he's saying things to me in his writing.
After sentencing, the world moved on. That is what usually happens. A case dominates headlines. Discussions stretch across news panels and documentaries. And then gradually the noise fades. Attention shifts. New stories replace old ones. The public narrative settles into a final version. A conclusion that feels complete, even when questions remain. Inside prison, time moves differently. There are no headlines there, no breaking news banners, only routine, repetition, silence. And silence has a way of forcing reflection. Not always honest reflection, but reflection shaped by memory, emotion, and the human need to make sense of actions that cannot be undone. For some offenders, silence becomes withdrawal. For others, it becomes a problem. Because when someone's identity becomes permanently tied to a single event, the desire to speak again can grow stronger over time. Not necessarily to change the legal outcome, that door is closed, but to influence something else: perception, understanding, narrative. And narrative is powerful. It determines how people remember a case. It determines what details become central. It determines whether someone is seen only through the worst thing they did or through the story they later tell about it. That is where correspondence enters. Sometime after the legal chapter ended, Chris Watts began writing letters from prison. Not official statements, not interviews arranged through media channels. Personal letters, slower, quieter, more controlled. The kind of communication that allows someone to choose every word without interruption. Writing creates distance. Distance from interrogation pressure. Distance from immediate scrutiny. Distance that allows explanation to replace reaction. But letters also require an audience. Someone willing to respond. Someone willing to listen, long after the world has stopped asking questions. That audience arrived in the form of a writer. An author named Cherlyn Cadle began corresponding with Chris Watts. What started as communication developed into an ongoing exchange. Letters moving between a prison cell and the outside world. Conversations unfolding away from investigators, away from courtrooms, and away from the timeline that originally defined the case. And that detail matters. Because when an offender chooses to communicate with an author, the purpose is rarely random. Authors document stories. Authors preserve narratives. Authors create a space where explanation can exist in long form rather than short statements. In other words, authors create permanence. According to accounts of the correspondence, Chris Watts invited the communication. He shared reflections, descriptions, and versions of events that extended beyond what had already been established publicly. The letters introduced something subtle but important, a shift from confession to storytelling. That shift is not always obvious at first. Confession focuses on what happened. Storytelling introduces why, how, and interpretation. And interpretation is where narrative begins to evolve. The tone of these letters drew attention. Some passages suggested remorse. Others focused heavily on internal experience, feelings, thoughts, spiritual framing, attempts to explain the psychological state surrounding the crime. Analysts and readers began noticing patterns common in post-conviction communication. Attempts to contextualize actions, attempts to find meaning, attempts to position events within a broader personal narrative. None of this changes the facts of the case, but it changes how the story is told. Because once letters exist, the case is no longer frozen in the moment of confession. It becomes something dynamic again, a conversation rather than a conclusion. Details can expand, emphasis can shift, memory can reshape how events are described. And that raises a difficult question. When someone begins telling their story again after sentencing, are they revealing truth, processing trauma, seeking understanding, or attempting to regain control over how they are remembered? The answer is rarely simple. What is clear is this: the correspondence ensured the case did not remain silent. The story resurfaced, not through new evidence, but through words chosen years later, words written slowly, intentionally, with time to consider what would be said and what would be left out. Because omission is part of storytelling too. And that is what makes these letters psychologically significant. Not just what they include, but what they emphasize, what they repeat, what they reinterpret. Narrative shifts rarely happen in dramatic moments. They happen gradually, across sentences, across explanations, across the quiet space where someone tries to make their past livable inside their own mind. This is where the story changes, not legally, not factually, but narratively. And once narrative changes begin, comparisons become inevitable between what was said then and what is being said now. Because the letters did something subtle but powerful. They introduced another version of the story. If you're still watching, you're already stepping into the psychological side of true crime, the part that exists after the verdict. Subscribe to Sinister Tales if you want more deep explorations like this. And tell me in the comments, when offenders speak years later, do you think they're revealing truth or rewriting memory? Because the next part of this story is where the words themselves start to matter. What he chose to say, how he chose to say it, and what those choices may reveal. Once the letters began circulating, attention shifted from the existence of the correspondence to something more unsettling, the language inside it. Words matter, especially when they are written after everything is over, after the investigation, after the confession, after sentencing, when every sentence is no longer reactive, but deliberate. The letters were not written in the chaos of accusation. They were written with time, with distance, with the ability to reflect, reinterpret, and choose how events would be described years after they occurred. And choice reveals intention. Readers and analysts began focusing on tone first, not just what was said, but how it was said. Some passages carried the language of remorse, acknowledgments of harm, references to regret, attempts to express sorrow. But alongside that language sat something else, self-focused framing, explanations that centered internal experience, descriptions of emotional states, efforts to articulate what he felt, what he believed, what he perceived in the moments surrounding the crime. That balance is psychologically significant, because remorse language can coexist with narrative positioning. Someone can express regret while still shaping how responsibility is understood. Letters create space for that complexity. They allow someone to move between confession and explanation without interruption. Explanation changes perception. It introduces context. It introduces reasoning. It introduces interpretation. And interpretation is where narrative shifts begin. In several discussions about the letters, observers noted how events were described with greater detail than earlier public accounts. But detail does not automatically equal clarity. Detail can illuminate, or it can redirect focus. The emphasis placed on certain moments, certain feelings, certain sequences can subtly reshape how a story is experienced by the reader. This is not always intentional manipulation. Sometimes it is memory. Memory is not a recording, it is reconstruction. Over time, people revisit events repeatedly inside their own minds, and each revisit can adjust emphasis, highlighting some elements while softening others. The story someone tells years later is rarely identical to the story told immediately after an event. But in criminal cases, those differences matter, because consistency signals stability, and shifts invite scrutiny. Another notable pattern within offender correspondence is meaning-making. The human mind struggles with irreversible actions, particularly actions that permanently define identity. Letters often become a place where offenders search for frameworks that make their behavior understandable to themselves. Psychological explanations, emotional explanations, spiritual explanations. Spiritual language appeared in portions of the letters. That does not automatically indicate sincerity or insincerity. What it indicates is an attempt to place events within a larger moral structure, a way to process guilt, seek redemption, or reinterpret identity after conviction. For some readers, that language suggests remorse. For others, it suggests reframing, and reframing is powerful. Because reframing does not deny the event, it changes how the event is mentally organized. It moves focus from action to internal struggle, from outcome to emotional state, from responsibility to explanation. That shift is subtle, but it changes how stories feel. Analysts also pay attention to omission, what is not emphasized. Letters can expand certain moments while minimizing others. They can explore internal thoughts in depth while describing external actions more briefly. That imbalance is not unusual. People naturally gravitate toward explaining themselves rather than restating facts already known. But again, choice matters. What someone returns to repeatedly often reveals what they are trying to resolve internally. What they move past quickly can reveal what remains difficult to confront directly. Letters become psychological maps, not perfect representations of truth, but reflections of focus. And focus tells a story. By this stage, the correspondence had done something important. It reopened discussion, not about what happened, but about how the story continues to evolve after conviction. The letters introduce nuance, interpretation, and tension between established facts and personal narrative. Not contradiction in a dramatic sense, but movement. Movement away from the fixed moment of confession toward a living narrative that continues to change over time. And once movement exists, comparisons become inevitable. Earlier statements are revisited, language is analyzed, small differences carry weight, because when the story changes, people notice. That is the power of post-conviction writing. It does not alter the outcome, but it alters conversation. It invites analysis that would not exist if silence had remained. And sometimes, that analysis reveals patterns that were invisible during the urgency of the original investigation. The letters did not close questions. They created new ones. And those questions lead directly to the most important tension in this entire story: the differences between versions of events across time. What was said first, what was said later, and what those differences may reveal about memory, responsibility, and the human need to live with irreversible actions. Because once multiple versions exist, the story is no longer static. It becomes layered. And layers are where psychology lives. If you're still here, you're exactly where Sinister Tales lives, inside the details most people overlook. Subscribe if you want more deep psychological breakdowns like this. And tell me in the comments, do you believe letters reveal truth over time? Or do they reveal how someone wants to be remembered? Because the next part of this story is where comparison begins. And comparison changes everything.